Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive.
Where we're going to be talking about
The history of sexuality in the West.
Ooh.
Now you might be thinking, that sounds a little dry, but
Yeah.
trust me, this is going to be anything but.
We're going to be using Michel Foucault's The History of Sexuality
Good.
to uncover some seriously surprising insights.
And you might even end up
Questioning things you thought.
just natural.
Yeah, you know what's so fascinating about Foucault?
Is that he really challenges those assumptions.
He says that our understanding of sexuality,
Which is something so personal, right?
Well,
Isn't
right.
this like universal truth?
but it's actually a product of history.
And power dynamics.
Are you saying that how we think about
And even experience something as intimate as sex.
is influenced by, like, the society we live in?
Absolutely.
And one of the biggest ideas that Foucault tackles,
There's this thing called the repressive hypothesis.
the repressive hypothesis.
Yeah, the idea that Western society has been repressing sexuality.
This is like the 17th century. Okay.
Like we were all just
Bursting with these pent-up desires.
hidden under these really strict Victorian values.
Yeah, I've definitely heard that before.
It's like we were all supposed to be...
These, like, prudish, buttoned-up folks.
Right, exactly.
But Foucault says, hold up, not so fast.
He says that instead of repressing sexuality...
Modern society actually created this whole system,
for talking about it...
classifying it.
and ultimately controlling it. He calls this the deployment of sexuality.
That's interesting.
Because we definitely talk about sex a lot today.
Maybe even more openly than in the past.
But are you saying that all this openness is actually a form of control?
It's not necessarily...
You're being open or closed?
It's about how power operates
Foucault says it's way more subtle.
than just saying no to certain things.
It's about creating categories.
defining what's normal.
And encouraging us to constantly
I'd say
confess our desires
Power shapes the very framework.
of how we understand and experience sexuality.
I'm starting to see what you mean. So it's not just about the rules.
It's like the whole game is rigged.
In a way we don't even realize.
Exactly.
And these rules of the game
Are set by power structures,
social norms,
institutions.
even what we think of as scientific facts,
So if power is so central,
to how we understand sexuality.
does that mean we can never really know ourselves?
Yeah. Or our desires.
That's the million-dollar question.
Foucault would argue
That there's no true self.
that's completely outside of these power relations.
Our identities are always shaped.
By the discourses and power structures that surround us.
So it's like we're born into this game.
That's already in play.
Yes, but that doesn't mean we're totally stuck.
By understanding how power works.
We can start to question those norms
And maybe even create new possibilities.
for understanding and expressing our sexuality.
This reminds me of something you mentioned earlier.
About power not just being about repression,
But also about creating discourse.
even talking about sex in a negative way,
Keeps it front and center.
right?
Foucault uses the example of the confessional.
It started as a religious thing, right?
Right.
Confessing your sins.
But it became this way of making people talk about their deepest desires.
Even if it was to condemn them,
It's like the more you try to shut something down,
the more it pops up somewhere else.
right,
And Foucault points out,
that this shift from traditional systems of marriage and family,
where sex was about,
carrying on the family line,
to a system that focuses on the individual,
and their desires,
happened alongside some big changes in society.
especially with the rise of the middle class.
The bourgeoisie.
So you're saying there was a whole different system.
For regulating sexuality before we get
There's
to the...
modern focus on the individual.
Yes.
Foucault calls the old system the deployment of alliance.
And the new one, the deployment of sexuality.
Okay.
The old system was all about marriage
Yeah.
and keeping that bloodline pure.
It sounds like those old family portraits
With everyone in their fancy clothes.
trying to show off their good breeding. Exactly.
It's a completely different game than the one we're playing now.
Where it's all about individual desire.
And expressing your true self.
So this new deployment of sexuality emerges.
With a new set of players.
New rules.
And new ways to control the game.
You got it.
And it's all tied into this idea of vital power.
How those in power manage and control populations.
And that leads us to another big concept.
Scientia sexualis.
The scientific study of sex.
It sounds like this wasn't just about...
Neutral scientific observation.
But it was tied to power structures, right?
Absolutely.
Foucault argues that the science of sex
That popped up in the 19th century.
isn't just about observing.
It was also about trying to manage and control people's sex lives.
He gives some pretty shocking examples in the book, too.
Like how women were diagnosed with hysteria
for having, like, normal
Oh,
emotions,
how they became obsessed.
with controlling children's sexuality, and the rise of eugenics
This idea of creating a perfect human race,
is another dark example.
of how the study of sex was used to control people.
What's wild is that even though they were trying to control sexuality,
All this focus actually created even more talk about it.
it's like trying to hold water in your
The
hands.
tighter you squeeze.
The more slips through your fingers.
Precisely.
The more they tried to control it.
The more it became the center of attention.
And that's just one of the fascinating contradictions.
That Foucault helps us unpack.
So we've been talking about how power shapes our understanding of sexuality, but how does this power actually work?
What are the mechanisms at play?
That's a great question.
It's one thing to say that power is involved.
But it's another to see how it actually works in our lives.
Foucault describes this process through something he calls the juridico-discursive model.
Juridical what now?
Okay, you have to break that down for me.
And for our listener.
Yeah, you got it.
Basically, it means that power over sexuality works through a combination of laws.
And the way we talk about sex.
Okay, I'm starting to see what you mean.
So it's not just about laws telling us what we can't do.
It's also about the whole conversation surrounding sex, right?
Like what we consider normal or taboo.
Exactly.
Think about it this way.
Even if there weren't specific laws about certain sexual practices
There are still all these unspoken rules and judgments.
that shape how we think and feel about sex.
That makes total sense.
It's like an invisible script we all get handed.
Even if we don't realize it,
And here's the thing.
this system is always changing.
What might have been shocking 100 years ago.
Could be totally normal today.
So even though it feels like power is limiting us
It's also constantly creating new ways of thinking.
and experiencing the world,
You got it.
Foucault's point is that power isn't just about saying no.
It's also about creating new possibilities.
No identity.
Even new forms of pleasure.
It's like power is this constant dance.
Pushing and pulling.
Reshaping and reshaping.
How we understand ourselves and our desires.
Exactly.
And Foucault is really interested.
And how this dance has changed over time.
He talks about how in the West,
There's been this major shift from what he calls a deployment of alliance.
to a deployment of sexuality.
We touched on this a bit earlier.
But I think it's worth diving deeper.
Remind us.
What are the key differences between these two deployments?
Okay, so picture this,
In the deployment of alliance,
which was the dominant system for centuries.
it was all about marriage and family.
Power was all about controlling who could marry whom.
Who inherited what?
And basically keeping those family trees nice and tidy.
So in this system,
Sex was more about like a social contract.
than about individual pleasure or desire.
You got it.
It was about maintaining order and control at a societal level.
But then, as the world changed,
With the rise of capitalism and a focus on the individual,
a new system emerged.
the deployment of sexuality,
This new system shifted the focus to the individual body.
and the pursuit of pleasure.
It's interesting because on the surface, that sounds way more freeing, right?
Like finally we can express ourselves and pursue our desires.
That's the tricky part.
While it might seem more liberating,
Foucault argues that this new system actually brought about new and more subtle forms of control.
especially through this thing called biopower.
Oh yeah, we talked about biopower in a previous deep dive.
It's basically how those in power manage and control entire populations, right?
Like through public health campaigns.
Or population control measures.
Exactly.
And the deployment of sexuality is a key part of biopower.
By focusing on the individual's body and desires,
Those in power could control people on a much deeper level.
even shaping their identities.
So it's like they zoom in on the individual instead of the family unit.
But the goal of control remains the same.
You got it.
And one of the key ways this played out
Was through the rise of scientia sexualis.
the scientific study of sex.
Right.
And as we talked about before,
This wasn't just neutral science.
it was totally entangled with power.
It was about classifying
Analyzing.
and controlling people's sexual behavior.
Exactly.
Think about it.
The emergence of sexology in the 19th century,
Led to all these experts.
doctors, scientists, even religious figures.
Suddenly having opinions on what was normal and abnormal when it came to sex.
It's like they took something so personal and intimate.
And put it under a microscope.
Yes, and that had a huge impact.
On how people saw themselves and their desires.
Foucault has this famous line where he talks about how the sodomite had been a temporary aberration The homosexual was now a species.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
It's like by studying and categorizing people,
They created entirely new identities.
often with negative consequences.
Exactly.
These categories were definitely not neutral.
They were loaded with power,
Certain sexualities were labeled as healthy,
while others were deemed sick or perverse.
and this had real consequences for people's lives.
It's like the more we try to define and categorize things,
The more we create shadows and blind spots.
That's such a great point.
And Foucault would say that this is one of the biggest paradoxes.
Of sexuality in the modern world.
Yeah.
The more we talk about it and try to liberate it,
The more it becomes subject to new forms of regulation and control.
so if this deployment of sexuality is so pervasive,
Does that mean we're all just stuck?
is there any way to break free from these power dynamics?
That's the big question, right?
Foucault doesn't necessarily give us a clear roadmap.
But he does suggest that resistance is always possible.
Power is never absolute.
So even though we're all caught up in these power structures,
We're not completely helpless.
there are always cracks in the system.
Places where we can push back and challenge the norms.
Exactly.
And that's where Foucault's work becomes so important.
It gives us the tools to understand how power operates.
So we can be more critical and aware of how it's shaping our lives.
It's like he's giving us a flashlight,
To see the hidden mechanisms at play.
even in the most intimate parts of our lives.
Exactly.
And once we see those mechanisms,
We can start to dismantle them.
and create new possibilities for ourselves.
And for each other.
So we've been talking about these big abstract ideas,
Like deployment of sexuality and biopower.
but I think it would be helpful to get more specific.
Can you give us some concrete examples of how this is played out in Western society?
Absolutely.
Foucault identifies 4 main strategic unities.
Where power and knowledge converged around sexuality.
Especially in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Strategic unities.
I love that term.
It sounds so intentional.
Like a carefully crafted plan.
That's exactly what they were.
These weren't just random developments.
They were interconnected strategies to manage and control populations.
Through the lens of sexuality.
Okay, I'm hooked.
Tell me more about these strategic unities.
The first one is what Foucault calls the historization of women's bodies.
Oh, right.
Touched on this earlier.
It's basically the idea that women's bodies were seen as inherently unstable.
Prone to all sorts of mysterious ailments,
Yes.
a whole range of female experiences.
From anxiety and depression to just feeling tired or irritable.
Were labeled as hysteria.
It was basically a way to pathologize women's emotions and bodies. It's crazy how this idea of hysteria has lingered for so long.
Even today, women are often dismissed or not taken seriously because of their emotions.
Absolutely.
And that's why it's so important to understand where these ideas come from.
So we can challenge them and create new, more empowering narratives.
Okay, so that's the first strategic unity.
What about the other 3?
The second one is the pedagogization of children's sex.
So this is about how society became obsessed.
With controlling children's sexuality, right?
Exactly.
Foucault traces how in the 19th century.
There was this sudden explosion of concern about things like masturbation.
And the need to protect children from any kind of sexual corruption.
It makes me think of all those old books on child rearing.
Filled with warnings about the dangers of self-abuse.
And the importance of strict discipline.
Yes.
And this wasn't just limited to parents.
Doctors and scientists got in on it, too.
Starting to see any sign of childhood sexuality as a potential problem that needed to be fixed.
And I imagine this led to some pretty harsh interventions, right?
Unfortunately, yes.
Some children were subjected to punishments,
Yes.
even medical procedures.
All in the name of controlling their sexuality.
It's a sad reminder of how the quest to control sexuality,
Can have really damaging consequences.
especially for the most vulnerable among us.
Exactly.
Okay, moving on to the third strategic unity.
The socialization of procreative behavior,
So this is about controlling reproduction,
particularly within the context of marriage and family.
right?
Foucault describes how during this period,
There was a growing anxiety about population growth.
and the well-being of the nation.
And this anxiety led to all sorts of attempts to control reproduction.
It makes me think of the ideas of Thomas Malthus,
Who warned about overpopulation.
and advocated for population control measures.
Yes.
And there were many other
From
interventions,
public health campaigns about hygiene and family planning.
to moral crusades against things like prostitution,
And these interventions weren't always about genuine concern.
for people's well-being.
No, definitely not.
Foucault points out that these efforts to control procreation
were often tied to economic and political agendas.
Like the need for a healthy workforce or a stable social order.
It's like they were using sexuality as a tool to achieve these larger goals.
Whether it was about the nation,
The economy.
or maintaining social control.
Exactly.
And this had a huge impact on how people experienced sex
All right.
and family life.
Okay. Ready for the fourth strategic unity.
Hit me with it.
This one is probably the most controversial.
It's what Foucault calls the psychiatrization of perverse pleasure.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Tell me more.
Basically, it's about how certain sexual desires and practices
Aim to be seen as mental illnesses.
requiring medical treatment.
So we're talking about things like homosexuality,
Fetishism,
sadomasochism,
anything that fell outside the norm.
of heterosexual reproductive sex.
You got it.
Foucault traces how, in the late 19th century,
There was this growing medical and scientific fascination.
with what they called sexual perversions.
And this coincided with the rise of psychoanalysis, right?
Freud and his ideas about the unconscious.
Yes.
Freud and his followers played a huge role in pathologizing these behaviors.
Seeing them as rooted in some sort of unconscious conflict or trauma
And this led to the development of all these therapies.
designed to cure people of their so-called perversions.
So instead of focusing on external rules and prohibitions
They shifted the focus to the internal world.
of the individual psyche,
Exactly.
it was a new and powerful way of controlling sexuality.
By trying to shape people's desires and identities at the level of the unconscious.
Wow, that's pretty intense.
So to recap these four strategic unities:
The historization of women's bodies,
the pedagogization of children's sex,
the socialization of procreative behavior,
and the psychiatrization of perverse pleasure.
represented a sort of master plan for controlling sexuality in the modern West.
Exactly.
And what's so brilliant about Foucault's analysis
Mhm.
is that he shows how these seemingly separate developments are actually interconnected. They form this web of power that shapes how we think about sexuality
Bodies.
and ourselves,
It's like a giant tapestry.
woven together with different threads.
But ultimately creating a single coherent picture.
Yeah.
And this tapestry is constantly evolving.
As power dynamics shift
Yeah.
and new forms of knowledge and control emerge,
This makes me wonder.
if power is so central to how we understand sexuality,
Is there any way to have a truly liberating or transgressive sexual experience?
can we ever escape these power dynamics?
That's a really important question.
And Foucault grapples with it throughout his work.
He doesn't give us easy answers.
But he does suggest that resistance is always possible.
So you're saying that even though power is everywhere,
It's not all powerful.
there are always ways to push back,
To challenge the norms.
to create our own meanings.
Exactly.
And that's one of the most empowering aspects of Foucault's work,
It's not about giving us a set of answers.
but about giving us the tools
About resist.
to imagine new possibilities.
It's like he's giving us a map of the terrain.
But we still have the freedom to choose our own path.
Exactly.
And that's where the real work begins.
In using these tools to navigate the complexities of sexuality
Power and desire.
and to create a world where sexuality is a source of joy and liberation.
Not oppression.
That's a beautiful thought.
So we've talked a lot about power.
But what about the idea of truth?
Where does that fit into Foucault's analysis of sexuality?
That's a key question.
Foucault challenges the idea
That there's one single objective truth about sexuality.
waiting to be discovered
Instead, he argues that what we consider true about sex
is always shaped by power relations.
and the discourses that create them,
So it's not just about what we know about sex.
but about who gets to decide what counts as knowledge.
Exactly.
Foucault uses the term regime of truth.
To describe how power shapes what we consider to be true,
Valor.
legitimate.
And sexuality has been a prime target for these regimes of truth.
Can you give us some examples of how this has played out historically?
Absolutely.
Think about the medicalization of homosexuality.
For much of the 20th century,
Homosexuality was classified as a mental illness.
by medical and psychological professionals
This was based on a specific set of scientific discourses,
that pathologize same-sex attraction.
and that classification had real-world consequences, right?
It was used to justify discrimination
Deny people jobs and housing.
and even subject them to harmful treatments like conversion therapy.
Exactly.
But eventually, activists and researchers challenged this regime of truth,
Arguing that homosexuality wasn't a mental illness.
but a natural variation of human sexuality.
And in 1973, the American Psychiatric Association.
Finally removed homosexuality from its list of mental disorders.
So what was considered true about homosexuality changed,
Not because some new scientific discovery was made.
but because of a shift in power.
A challenge to the dominant discourse.
Exactly.
And that's Foucault's point.
Truth about sexuality isn't something fixed and unchanging.
It's something that's produced, debated, and constantly evolving.
Within specific social and historical contexts.
This makes me think about the debates happening today.
About gender identity and trans rights.
There's so much controversy about what it means to be transgender.
And how to address it.
Yes.
And those debates are at their core about power and truth.
They're about who gets to define these categories.
What's considered normal.
And who has access to resources and support.
So Foucault's work isn't just about understanding the past.
It's also about understanding how these power dynamics continue to shape our present, right?
Absolutely.
His work gives us this critical lens to examine how power operates.
Not just in big historical events.
But in our everyday lives, our relationships.
And even our own thoughts and desires.
It's like he's giving us X-ray vision.
To see the hidden structures of power.
That influence us every day.
And once we see them.
We can start to challenge them.
And create new possibilities.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
From the repressive hypothesis and the deployment of sexuality.
To these 4 strategic unities and the concept of regimes of truth.
But I want to circle back to something we talked about earlier.
The distinction between the deployment of alliance and the deployment of sexuality.
Can we unpack that a little bit more?
Absolutely.
Remember, the deployment of alliance was all about regulating sexuality.
Through marriage and family structures, right?
It was about controlling inheritance.
Maintaining social stability.
And basically keeping those bloodlines pure.
It sounds very strategic.
Very calculated.
Like society was playing a big game of chess with people's lives.
Exactly.
And in this system, individual desires were basically irrelevant.
What mattered was the larger goal of social control.
But then, as the world changed,
we saw the emergence of the deployment of sexuality.
Which shifted the focus to the individual body.
And the pursuit of pleasure.
Right.
It's like the spotlight shifted from the family unit to the individual.
Exactly.
And on the surface, that might seem more liberating, right?
But Foucault argues that this new system actually brought with it new and more insidious forms of control.
It's almost like they traded one set of chains for another.
In a way, yes.
And the 4 strategic unities we discussed earlier?
The historization of women's bodies.
The pedagogization of children's sex.
The socialization of procreative behavior.
And the psychiatrization of perverse pleasure.
Those are all key examples of how this new deployment of sexuality played out.
So even though it seems like we're more free to express ourselves and explore our desires,
these new forms of control are operating on a much deeper level.
Shaping our identities and our very sense of self.
Exactly.
And that's the challenge we face today.
To understand these historical forces that are still shaping our lives.
And to find ways to resist them.
To challenge them.
And to create new possibilities for ourselves and future generations.
So if we're all caught up in these power dynamics,
is it even possible to have a truly authentic or liberating sexual experience?
That's the million-dollar question.
And I don't think there's a simple answer.
But I think Foucault's work gives us some important clues.
He encourages us to be critical.
To question the taken-for-granted assumptions.
And to be aware of how power operates.
Even in the most intimate parts of our lives.
It's like he's saying, wake up.
Don't just accept the rules of the game.
Figure out how the game is rigged.
And they find ways to play it on your own terms.
Exactly.
And that's where the real work begins.
It's about reclaiming our desires.
Shaping them in ways that serve our own values.
And creating new possibilities for pleasure, connection, and liberation.
You know, we've been talking a lot about power and control.
But there's another piece of the puzzle I'm really curious about.
Desire.
Where does desire fit into Foucault's analysis?
That's a great question.
And it's one that Foucault spends a lot of time exploring.
He argues that desire isn't this, like, pure,
untamed force that exists outside of power.
Instead, he says,
desire is actually shaped and produced
by the very power structures that try to control it.
Okay, hold on.
Are you saying that even our deepest desires,
the things we long for,
aren't really our own?
Like they're somehow imposed on us by society.
It's not about being like...
it's implanted with desires.
It's more subtle than that. Foucault's point is that power doesn't just try to shut down desire.
It also fuels it.
Molds it.
And steers it in specific directions.
So it's not just about saying no to certain desires.
It's also about creating an environment where certain desires flourish.
While others are suppressed.
Exactly.
Think about the way we talk about virginity, for example.
In many cultures, there's a huge emphasis on female virginity.
Seeing it as a sign of purity and worth.
That discourse actually creates a certain kind of desire.
A desire to possess something that's seen as valuable.
To protect it.
And control it.
And it's not just men who feel this desire.
Women internalize it too.
Sometimes seeing their virginity as a source of power.
It's almost like the more we place something on a pedestal,
the more we make it desirable.
Even if that desire is based on some pretty messed up ideas. It reminds me of that saying, forbidden fruit tastes the sweetest.
That's a great analogy.
And that's exactly how power works, according to Foucault.
It doesn't just say don't.
It creates a whole system of values, meanings, and desires.
That shape how we experience the world and our place in it.
And it's not just happening on a societal level, right?
I'm thinking about all the advertising we're bombarded with every day.
Advertisers are constantly trying to create new desires in us.
Convincing us we need certain products or experiences to be happy or attractive.
You're totally right.
And it just goes to show
that this deployment of sexuality that Foucault talks about
isn't just some historical thing that happened in the past.
It's an ongoing process.
Constantly adapting to new social trends, economic forces.
And even technologies.
So if our desires are so heavily influenced by these power structures,
is it even possible to know what we truly want?
Can we ever experience real pleasure and liberation?
Or are we always going to be caught up in this web of power and manipulation?
That's a tough question.
And Foucault doesn't offer any easy solutions.
But I think his work does challenge us to become
more aware and critical of the forces that shape our desires.
It's not about trying to eliminate desire altogether,
but about understanding where those desires come from
and how they might be serving the interests of power.
So it's about asking ourselves those tough questions.
Like, why do I want this?
Or who benefits from me wanting this?
Exactly.
And that's where the potential for resistance and change lies.
It's about reclaiming our desires,
shaping them in ways that align with our own values.
And creating new possibilities for pleasure and connection.
That aren't based on domination or control.
Wow.
This deep dive has been intense.
But also incredibly eye-opening.
Foucault's work can be challenging.
But it's so insightful.
And it really helps us understand the world and ourselves in a new way.
I agree.
And I think one of the most important messages we can take away from Foucault is this.
Power is never absolute.
There are always opportunities to resist.
To subvert.
To create change.
And that's where our hope lies.
In our capacity to imagine and create a world
where sexuality is a source of joy, connection, and liberation for everyone.
That's a powerful message to end on.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the history of sexuality.
We hope you've learned something new.
Maybe even had your mind blown a little bit.
And that you'll continue to explore these ideas in your own life.
It was a pleasure.
And remember,
keep questioning. Keep learning.
And keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
Until next time.
Happy diving.